Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Journal of Palestine's newest webinar, Education in a Time of Genocide. My name is Nadim Bawalsa, and I'm the Associate Editor for the journal. On this, the 654th day of the genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza, educational institutions across North America and Europe continue to be sites of rampant repression and criminalization of student and faculty activism and speech on Palestine and Israel's genocide. In this dystopian reality where spaces of knowledge production, self-expression, and learning have turned into spaces of police brutality, disciplinary action, and coerced silencing, I am honored to moderate this discussion with four renowned scholars, educators, and activists. Muhannad Ayyash was born and raised in Silwan, Al-Quds, before immigrating to Canada, where he is professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He's also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Ayyash has authored two books, Lordship and Liberation in Palestine, Israel, The Promise of Decolonial Sovereignties, and A Hermeneutics of Violence, a Four-Dimensional Conception. Lara Deeb is the Laura Vosbinder Hockett Endowed Chair and a professor of anthropology at Scripps College. Her most recent book is Love Across Difference, Mixed Marriage in Lebanon. She teaches classes on the Middle East in general, Palestine specifically, representations of Muslims in the US, and comparative borders and settler colonialism. Rebecca E. Carl is professor of history at NYU. She's the author of China's Revolutions in the Modern World, The Magic of Concepts, History and the Economic in 20th Century China, Mao Zedong and China in the 20th Century, and Staging the World, Chinese Nationalism at the Turn of the 20th Century. Shireen Seikali is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's the author of Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine. Her forthcoming book is titled From Baltimore to Beirut on the Question of Palestine. She is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Thank you all for being with us today. Please also note that all of our speakers have contributed incredible reflective essays, editorials, and articles to the latest issue of GPS. You can find these pieces by clicking on the author's hyperlinked names in the announcement to the event, or also we will be sharing them with you in the chat box. So I'd like to start with the three general questions posed in the description of the event and to invite each of our speakers to offer their insights. What does it mean to be a student and an educator at this time of violent suppression of narration, critical thought, and expression of and on Palestine? What does it mean to write and speak about genocide in academic settings? What is at stake for these educational institutions, faculty, and students now and in the longer term? Rebecca, let's please start with you.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me. I am not a scholar of Palestine. I work on Chinese history, but I've had occasion to teach on Palestine in my agrarian history classes, where I have worked with students on many issues having to do with land and agrarian histories in the region that we know as Palestine. But I wanted to start with just a comment that education in the time of genocide is like inhabiting a horror hall of mirrors. On that side are starving and dying masses of Palestinians, and on this side are university and government administrators trying to force us to avert our eyes, asserting that what we see and know to be true is a lie. It's our responsibility not to avert our eyes and to say clearly what is happening on our watch in this time. And it is genocide. And I very much appreciate the Journal of Palestinian Studies for refusing to allow us to avert our eyes and, in fact, focusing so clearly on these issues. I have a few opening points that I wanted to make in the short time that I was allotted for this first opening set of comments. And so my first point is to say that within academia these days, with the implicit compact that allowed the boards of trustees broad discretion in investing endowment funds in exchange for tenured faculty having broad discretion or academic freedom to teach what they want, to self-govern to a certain extent, and to earn a living wage has broken down in the current moment. The decades-long ongoing adjunctification of the professoriate, the debt financing of university operations, the dilution of tenure, and the increasingly bold interventions by state legislatures and shadowy right-wing organizations have fundamentally weakened this compact, or what we could also call a devil's bargain. Of course, faculty acceptance of board autonomy with regard to institutional finances and on decisions about the endowment investments, particularly in this moment as they have to do with investments in the state of Israel and the ongoing military procurements of weapons for the Israeli genocide. This compact was always problematic. Today, in the climate of an overall weakening of faculties and funding, it has become disastrous. Most recently, in the context of campus protests in support of Palestinian life and liberty against Israeli state genociding of the Palestinian people, boards of trustees have abandoned completely even the public posture of self-restraint and now routinely intervene directly into the academic life of the university. Secondly, then, the involvement of such shadowy organizations as MACA, Mothers Against Campus Anti-Semitism, Canary Mission, and Betar, for example, in identifying, doxing, and sending for university and State Department review lists of activists, faculty, and students to be deported, blackmailed, and or declared persona non grata and punished, and the responsiveness of our university administrations to these organizations, the outsourcing of university policy to such entities as AEN, Academic Engagement Network, an Israeli state-funded entity about which the Washington Square News just did a wonderful expose and how this network is tied to NYU. And this AEN, who have helped rewrite definitions of anti-Semitism, the ethnic or religious hatred of Jews, that conflate that form of odium with criticism of Zionism, a political ideology, and criticism of the actions of the State of Israel, political speech. The basic posture of university administrations towards what they now deem to be faculty as enemy rather than faculty as educational partners, all of this has created an overall hostile campus environment where everyone is a potential snitch and all of us are potentially at risk of being snitched upon, some, of course, more than others. The fact that some kinds of activity deemed anti-Semitic in the expansive conflationary version I just noted is condemned and punished, whereas other kinds of activity, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant, racist, misogynist, violently threatening either directly or through doxing, is given a broad pass. The enclosing of university spaces and the banning of outsiders, and as I have experienced, some insiders too, from access, all of this authorizes an environment that is generally and particularly hostile to student learning, faculty teaching, education, research, and community building. Just one more brief note before I turn it over for this opening set of comments. The AAUP versus Rubio lawsuit that was just concluded in a Boston courtroom has exposed without a shadow of a doubt how proactive this State Department and the so-called Homeland Security organs are, and ICE, of course, are towards foreign critics of what they call U.S. citizens, policy, and culture. With this broad stroke legitimation for potential or actual visa revocation and removal, what we in the lawsuit are calling ideological deportation, and with the cooperation and complicity of our institutional administrators who have criminalized pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist speech, our classrooms and universities have now become absolutely ground zero for hunting and criminalizing faculty and students. The chill has become a frozen wasteland. And while I have been on leave this past semester and have not been on campus in the United States, nevertheless, the ways in which my colleagues, my students, and my comrades have been affected are very clear. I can talk more about the situation at NYU in a little while, so let me leave my opening remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Muhannad, let's move on to you.
Thank you, Nadim, and thank you to the Institute of Palestine for Palestine Studies, the Journal of Palestine Studies for organizing this. It's an honor to share this panel with my fellow panelists here as well. What I wanted to kind of foreground here in the beginning is that the suppression and violence and censorship that we see on campuses in Canada, in the US, in the UK, in Germany, and elsewhere is 100% connected to the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Let's be first of all very clear, just to say what doesn't need to be said, but it's good to say it anyway. The violence that Palestinians are experiencing in Gaza is something that is unfathomable. Nothing that I've seen here, I'll speak for myself as my personal experience. There's nothing that I can face here, including if I get fired, that would remotely come close to anything that is happening to Palestinians in Gaza. But they are connected in the sense that a genocide like the one that we're seeing right now is not possible without its concealment as a genocide. And the suppression of Palestine studies and Palestinian critique, what I call in an article, the Palestinian critique of Zionism in the Israeli state, is part and parcel of that concealment of genocide. You cannot commit genocide unless you conceal it. It's that simple. Academic spaces remain one of the few spaces where Israel and its lobby groups have been unable to completely manage the honest pursuit of knowledge, where the truth about what Israel really is, what Zionism really is still discussed and openly researched and talked about by academics and students. And the efforts over the last few decades that have specifically targeted campuses, the reason for those efforts and their intensification is precisely because in those spaces that honest pursuit of knowledge has remained. So to me, in this moment of genocide, the number one thing for all of us to do is to insist on that honest pursuit of knowledge, is to continue to reveal the truth and reality of the Israeli and Zionist project, and to do that regardless of the consequences. For many academics, those consequences often tend to be minimal, to be honest with you. Full profs. I can certainly speak about that in Canada. I know there are some differences in the Canadian and American systems, but a full prof in Canada has really no consequences whatsoever if they spoke about the genocide in an honest way. Yet so many don't. And I would assume that it's the same picture in the U.S. That though our collective agreements might be different, I think a full prof in an American university will be okay with a couple of complaints to their chair or their dean. They'll still keep their job, but yet they refuse to do it. So to me, what this boils down to is that what we see in the state of academia today is that we see how so many of our colleagues are prioritizing things like their status. They're prioritizing things like, oh, I want to get this grant though, and if I speak out on this issue, I might not get this grant. Or if I speak out on Palestine honestly, I might not get invited to give the keynote lecture at my disciplinary association. Or if I don't do it, I might not be asked to be the editor of this prestigious journal. It's all related to status. And it's quite telling of the state of academia, where academics who are self-proclaimed to be anti-racist, decolonial, in support of universal human rights, support international law, are humanist, and so on, continue to prioritize their status over stopping a genocide. But you know, we need to just be very frank in our discussions here, insofar as we, place those individuals within their rightful place. As in, if you refuse at this moment to do the honest pursuit of knowledge, to speak truth to power, and you are prioritizing your status and your comfort and so on, then you are complicit in the genocide of the Palestinian people. This is not a hyperbole. It's not an exaggeration. As I said, a genocide is not possible without its concealment. So you're either helping conceal it or you're not. There's no gray area. There's no middle ground. There's no nuance, complexity, and so on and so forth. This is one of those watershed moments in history, and you're either on one side or the other. So to me, the question of how does it feel like to be in this space, it's simple. I've got to fight for truth and justice, regardless of the consequences. And guess what? I am a full tenured professor. I've faced zero consequences. I mean, there are some stories that I can tell you that some people might find, oh, that's really horrible and all that, but they're nothing. They're nothing compared to what Palestinians go through in Palestine. So I'm not going to sit here and cry about this and that censorship or this and that marginalization, this or that setback, because they pale in comparison to being on the wrong side of history and helping the concealment of genocide. And that's where I'll end my preliminary comments.
Thank you, Muhannad. Lara, please.
Well, first, let me add my thanks to all of you for inviting me to share this space and to be in conversation with these extraordinary colleagues and activists. I really appreciate both of your comments so far, Rebecca and Muhannad, a great deal. And honestly, I mean, it feels like all the words have been said and we've been screaming genocide over and over, and we have no choice except to keep speaking as the only option against erasure and denial. And so when I first read these questions, that was basically like, that was my response. But I'm going to try to say a bit more. I find it both unbearably depressing and strengthening to remember that in some ways, these are not unprecedented times for those of us teaching in the US right now, which, to be clear, is not a comment to suggest that the genocide in Gaza is anything beyond, unimaginable violence, but instead is a comment to try to understand the context of the repression of knowledge production and thought here on this continent. As we know, US history is full of periods wherein critical thought and expression on other issues has been violently suppressed, whether McCarthyism or the decades of suppression of non-white histories and experiences within the US educational system, especially but not only the erasure and suppression of Black and Indigenous history and experience. And even in the material sense, the current moment is not unprecedented. For example, the law that the government invoked when they tried to deport Mahmoud Khalil is a 1952 law designed to deport immigrants on ideological grounds, right? So then it was about communism. Today it's about Palestine. These are also not unprecedented times in the US for the suppression of critical thought and expression on Palestine specifically. I mean, we can talk to any elder in our field and they have harrowing stories. So, for example, over a decade ago, Jessica Winiger and I wrote a book called Anthropology's Politics, and for that, we researched some of this history. And the earliest instance we found of an attack on Palestine-related speech was in 1969, when the American Jewish Committee circulated a memo that alleged that college campuses were the sites of an Arab propaganda campaign against Israel. And that memo set off an ongoing offensive to thwart the hiring of Palestinian and other Arab faculty, to silence Palestinian perspectives on campuses, and to prevent any criticism of the Israeli state on our campuses. And then over time, multiple interest groups joined that campaign, including the ADL, which in 1983 produced a literal black book, like a pamphlet, of scholars that were accused of anti-Semitism because they criticized the Israeli state. So the weaponization of anti-Semitism goes back at least that far. And they distributed that to allies and leaders on campuses and asked them to surveil or discipline those scholars. And then obviously, the internet, social media, et cetera, have exponentially intensified all this, with groups from Campus Watch to Canary Mission to the AEN to dozens of others at this point. So while not unprecedented, there's obviously something different about the intensity of the repression we face in relation to Palestine as well as something far more violent and visible about the ways that state and non-state actors are colluding to suppress expression and critical thought on Palestine. So the change isn't just from photocopied handouts to social media, but it's about a cooperation forged over years that really came to the foreground in the second decade of this century, which is a cooperation between well-funded Zionist interest groups, often connected to the Israeli state, including those groups that are surveilling faculty and students, and the US state. And that cooperation is emerging in all sorts of ways. So, for example, in that AAUP Mesa versus Rubio lawsuit that Rebecca just mentioned, the government admitted to using Canary Mission to determine who to target for visa revocations. So we're now starting to see the degree to which the US state and these other organizations have in fact been working or colluding hand in hand for decades. And even though this is Palestine specific, I think it also shows us with even greater clarity, and this brings me to the third question you posed, Nadim, that the stakes are high for both speech on Palestine and for higher education overall. So attacks on free expression in relation to Palestine are central to a long history of attacks on higher education in the US, right? Until recently, it was often at the state level and often into relation to teaching race, gender, and sexuality. So you have efforts to repress criticism of Israel hand in hand with efforts to repress teaching about settler colonialism, racism, homophobia, police brutality, and incarceration in the US. It's all connected. And today, it's developed into this all-out, multiple federal agency, federal assault on higher education institutions and on critical thinking and knowledge production. And that's the moment we're all living in at the moment, here at least, ranging from federal funding cuts to attacks on teaching ethnic studies and critical race theory, to the weaponized deployment of accusations of anti-Semitism, to the violent attacks on student protesters, to the kidnapping of international students off the streets and into federal immigration detention. So, of course, one of the major issues at stake, and the primary issue at the moment at stake, is our capacity to speak and write and teach freely about Palestine, which is precisely why the Journal of Palestine Studies and the Institute for Palestine Studies are such critically important spaces that we need to fight to preserve as well. The stakes are also the survival of institutions of higher education themselves as institutions that support and cultivate and teach free inquiry and critical thinking on a whole range of issues, right? As institutions that defend their students and faculty's rights to independent thinking that's not constrained by government interference. So we're talking also about the preservation of First Amendment free speech rights and of adjacent academic freedom rights on our campuses. And, when I get to the question of what it means to speak about genocide in academic context, and this is where I sort of run out of words, except to say we just have to keep screaming and speaking and doing what we're doing. But then I also remember that we're not the first to do this. When I was an undergrad, my African studies professors were struggling with how to teach about the Rwanda genocide as they were teaching our classes. And we also, many of us, at least I teach about genocides of the past as well, right? So, but Gaza feels different, partly because of the live stream element, partly because we're living and teaching in a country that's participating actively in this genocide, and partly because for those of us here, this is a place and people we care deeply about. So I guess all I have to that is that we have no choice but to do what we can do from where we sit with the skills and resources and privileges we have to fight back for Palestine, against this genocide, and for higher education. Because the struggle against genocide and the struggle for higher education are absolutely entangled. And as I see it, we have no other choice but to continue to speak and write and teach and fight. So I'll stop there and pass this now on to Shireen.
Thank you all so much. It's such an honor to be with you all. I thought about it's great to come last because I can also reflect on some of what you all have said. And the first thing I want to say is that I think I've begun to also really think about the genocide as a changing set of horrors. So that, and I think she had, Abu Salim, the director of IPS, was saying this in his Instagram feed yesterday, and this is someone who is a scholar from Deir el-Balah, one of the most beautiful places in Gaza that was housing people, not housing, but a refuge for people who are now on the other end of an Israeli operation. And I think it's really important to think about the different stages of this genocide and what it has meant for us to live in those stages and teach and be educators in them. And I think in the beginning, there was much more for me insistence on vigilance, accountability, responsibility, organizing from that place of real vigilance. And, I want to lift up the work that so many of us have done on the organizing front. Every single person on this Zoom, I mean, Lara and I have worked really closely in National Faculty for Justice in Palestine. Rebecca has been deemed persona non grata on her campus for her organizing work. Muhannad has worked really hard in Canada. I do think it's really important. While I understand the critique, Muhannad, of status and the multiple ways that people have revealed themselves in the last 2 years, I think it's also really important to look at what we've gained. And in that sense, I think that part of the first thing I want to say that is kind of hopeful about the moment that we're in is that the attack on academia, the organized attack on academia, is because we have won the moral battleground. It is because we are teaching Palestinian history. It is because people like us have jobs in universities. And this wasn't always the case. So I think there are real, I think absolutely, Lada's invitation to think about all the things that we have experienced before is really important, all the continuities, but I think there are real ruptures in this moment. And this initial kind of vigilance that I was really holding on to changed to a kind of battle numbness at this point, in which we have to face our utter helplessness, the utter futility of organizing for over 2 years and not being able to affect any kind of material change. The fact that we have to witness people literally dying of hunger in front of our eyes and being shot down by U.S. contractors and U.S. funded Israeli soldiers. The fact that we are at this moment, right? And nothing we've done has been able to help any of this. At the same time that we ourselves have become a heightened target than we were before. So I think it's this mixture of helplessness and power that we have to think about as educators, and that we have to think through as we teach students. And I think for us, in many ways, for me, it's trying to remain on that spectrum of hope and despair. Although in this latest days, I feel like I'm not even interested in that spectrum anymore. I'm just kind of going through the motions and fighting in everywhere that I can. And I think a lot of us feel that way. I think Muhannad's reminder that we don't have that luxury while people are literally, dying of famine in front of us. I think that's really, really, an urgent reminder. But I do think that that we are at a stage of being numb and exhausted at this point. And we have to come together and think in new ways about how to move forward. And I think valuing education and understanding that the very idea of higher education is actually under threat at this moment, exactly as Lada is saying. And it didn't come under threat under the Trump administration. The decades of austerity that have basically attenuated the possibility of higher education, especially in public school systems like the ones that I teach, is really beyond, is really central to how we must understand this moment, how we have to organize against it. And even within these associations, right? Even within these institutions, again, there is a moral consensus that is building. Look at the case of the American Historical Association, a historical association that has been very conservative and will never take a stand on Palestine. The fact that 82% of the membership at a business meeting passed a resolution condemning scholasticide a term that Karma Nabulsi coined in 2009, and the AHA Council had to actually veto the resolution, not even take it to its 10,000 membership. Again, that I think that is an indication of the kind of moral change that is taking place. A second thing, I think, a second event that's really important to think about is the National Education Association, which again overwhelmingly voted to sever ties with the Anti-Defamation League, its weaponization of anti-Semitism, and the ways that it promoted logics that are anti-Black and racist. And again, its leadership also vetoed that vote. So I do think that that there is this, you know, and we've talked about this a lot in the American Historical Association context. There is this moment of anticipatory obedience where people are rushing to save themselves from the danger, but the danger is already here, and Palestine is a microcosm of that danger. Palestine is not something that is far away. It is not something that is happening to somewhere else. It is also actually a model of the kinds of violence and silencing that we all must learn to both fight and educate against. And I think that for me, the thing that I always return to and take my cues from are the Palestinians themselves in the Gaza Strip, are their insistence on narration, you know, how they are stripped of breath at the same time that they really hold tightly to the urgency of narration, of storytelling, and how in particular in this space where the entirety of the educational infrastructure has been destroyed, every single university, in 90% of the schools, every single archive, every single bookstore, every single library, and that the way that people are continuing to value education and continue that mission despite and against all those odds is really, I think, as Muhannad said, the inspiration for us to keep doing absolutely everything we can in every space that we can.
Thank you, Shireen. And thank you, everyone, for your insights. I think each of you spoke a bit, you know, I mean, apart from speaking from your own experiences in your own universities, I heard a lot, you know, from your own experiences as you know, working with the students as activists, as well as supporting them in their different actions on campuses. I want to turn now to the specific questions to each of you that are based on your pieces, recent pieces in JPS, and also on your experiences where you are based as faculty and supporters of the students you work with. Rebecca, let's go back to you. You've been involved in supporting students or student activists on NYU campus and have faced consequences for it. In your essay, you tell us what it means to be labeled persona non grata by your university, where you've been a tenured faculty member for 30 years. Can you tell us what this label has meant for you, for the students who were also labeled persona non grata, for NYU as an institution of knowledge, and for you as an educator, what this experience has been like for you? If you'd like to also you know, share some details about what happened last December, I think we would all benefit from hearing from your experience.
Thank you. As Muhannad mentioned,
Rebecca, we can't hear you very clearly. The volume might be low.
I have done nothing different.
Is there something blocking the microphone, maybe? No.
All right, can you hear me now?
A bit better, maybe just put the volume up, maybe. Is that what?
The volume is all the way
There
up.
we go. Perfect.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry, I don't know what happened. I didn't touch a thing other than unmuting myself. But okay, as Muhannad mentioned, for me as a full professor, there have been the persona non grata was a badge of honor. It meant that I was able to be very well seen for the work I do with students and with my faculty comrades. However, the consequences are distributed very unevenly, of course. For those who are not protected by tenure, for students, particularly international students, but students who also don't come from rich families, don't come from connected families, don't come from families who have a direct line to Linda Mills, our president, who has been directly responsible for criminalizing students and so on. PNG status has been extraordinarily destructive and extraordinarily difficult to handle. My own experience was minor. I mean, it was disturbing because it is a harbinger of the ways in which they are our administration, in complicity with government institutions and preemptive obedience to what is presumed to be the directives of the contemporary state, which I would say, I mean, as Shireen made clear, I mean, the preemption is about our institutions being really scared about us. They're really scared of us. We have made a mark. We have made them very scared. And so they're trying to shut us down because they are scared of what we will and do and might say. But in any case, my own experience, I take it as a personal badge of honor, but then as a alarming harbinger of what is going on in our universities at large. And which is very much about the suppression of student protest, not only around Palestine, but of course Palestine has been the lightning rod for this. But now the enclosure of our campuses, even NYU, which famously has an open campus, famously is part of the city, famously has no a university without walls, has now been walled in, checkpointed, apartheid, partitioned into spaces that some people can go with proper identification, and spaces where other people have to stay out without those without proper identification. And so the ways in which the universities have been cut up now into NYU is just one example. Of course, Columbia now is a prison, and with exclusion as its very biggest principle. And this has consequences for research on any issue because we can't get into libraries. I mean, researchers who are doing ancient China can't get into the library at Columbia to do their research because of now the ways in which universities are barricaded. And so the PNG status, the PNG designations are about exclusions. They're about how to exclude ideas, people, concepts, politics, and any number of other kinds of advocacies, and of course, how to exclude protest. I would end just now just by saying that in the AAUP versus Rubio lawsuit, precisely, Lara, what you were talking about as being the long historical context of these suppressions was used by the government as a defense for why this moment is no different from 1952, from any of the other moments at which suppression of free speech and academic speech and protest and conceptual thinking and so on. They use that as this defense about the moment not being unique. Precisely, this is not about Trump and the uniqueness of this moment, they said, but it's about the continuous efforts of the United States to prevent hostile people and ideas and forces from destroying our way of life and so on. And so it was really rather remarkable how they turned that history into a defense rather than into an indictment of these exclusionary policies. So that's rather a roundabout way of saying that the PNG for me personally was not unconsequential. But for many, many students and for faculty who do not have the benefit of citizenship, tenure, and security, PNG could be disastrous and has been disastrous for students I know who have had to leave campus, go home, forfeit their degrees, forfeit their fellowships, forfeit their status, and so on, all for the supposed crime of asking people, forcing people to look at the genocide, to look at the massacres and the horrors that are being perpetrated with our complicity in Israel and Palestine more generally.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Mohanad, let's move on to the Canadian scene. Your article explores student-led BDS initiatives in Canadian universities since the genocide, and you situate these campaigns on these campuses against the backdrop of the Canadian state's efforts to render knowledge around Palestine unintelligible, as you call it. Can you tell us more about what these campaigns have looked like from your experience and how they've confronted Canadian state suppression?
Yeah, so just very briefly, I mean, because a lot of this material is spelled out in the article if people are interested, but very briefly, what I mean about unintelligible is that the Canadian state basically turns particular discourses around Palestine that we can label under decolonial liberation, such as the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, as unintelligible, meaning they're not serious, they're hateful, they're anti-Semitic, they're misled, they're quote unquote radical, and so on. So they cast them as outside the sphere of acceptable, valid policy discourse around the question of Palestine and Israel. And the Canadian state has done this through a number of different policies and statements and so on. You know, I cite in the article, for example, the official line of the Canadian government, the motion passed in Parliament under the Liberals, is to condemn BDS and all its supporters, for instance. So while in Canada we still don't see the kind of draconian laws you have in the US against BDS, criminalizing it in many states, that condemnation acts as a kind of both as a quasi-legal suppression, a form of suppression, by basically telling anybody who adopts it that the Canadian government condemns you and thinks that you're hateful and not serious and should be cast out of the realm of acceptable discourse and so on. But it's a precursor to something like what we see in the US and the UK around BDS legislation. So for the longest time, the Canadian state has taken that position. It still holds it. Canadian universities more or less copy the same kind of response to BDS and students' demands for Palestinian decolonial liberation. They haven't released a motion like you saw in the federal government condemning BDS, but they do it in different ways. One of which is to basically continuously release statements that allude to the idea, if not explicitly, then indirectly, that any student body that is promoting BDS is anti-Semitic or getting close to being anti-Semitic or potentially anti-Semitic, and therefore has no place in academia, in the space of academia, as a quote-unquote open, tolerant, anti-racist space, right? So you see all kinds of efforts by university administrations continuing to this day to do that to Palestine solidarity work, especially that being done by students, but also faculty. Now, one of the promising things, to go on Shireen's note, to point out some of the promising developments that I see over the last 2 years, is that the students, instead of being afraid and cowering in the face of such allegations of racism and anti-Semitism and so on, which is of course complete blatant weaponization of anti-Semitism, they are responding with force against those institutions. And actually, they've shifted from, student activism for the longest time. We'd go to Canadian institutions and say, well, we believe you when you say you stand for anti-racism and universal human rights and international law. Why don't you do that for Palestine? You shouldn't do the Palestine exception. I'm kind of just paraphrasing here the general messaging. But that, the last 2 years, has shifted into, you know what? You're all complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians, and that is because you're foundationally settler, colonial, and imperial. That shift is critical because it directs us towards the actual truth of those institutions. This is what Indigenous scholars and activists have been saying about Canadian institutions for a long time. And I'm glad to see Palestine Solidarity starting to see that more clearly and agreeing with it and forcefully stating it and acknowledging that decolonization for Palestine also means decolonization of Canadian settler colonialism. And those linkages are being made in stronger ways than ever before. I'm also doing research now that interviews Palestinian and Indigenous activists, not just in university settings, but outside the university as well, and you can see those interconnections being made in much clearer terms for the activists than we've ever seen before. I even interviewed some of the older Palestinian activists who were so happy about that development and thanking the younger generation for showing them these kinds of interconnections. So something is fundamentally changing there, and that is something that I hope continues to develop and build. Because the decolonization of Palestine is about the decolonization, the larger project of decolonization from the age of colonial modernity. This is one of the central aspects for me of the Palestinian struggle, is that it is at the heart of an unfinished project of decolonization. Not just against settler colonialism, but against imperialism and the dehumanizing form of racialization that became prominent in the age of colonial modernity, among other things, colonial racial capitalism and so on. So this is kind of the shift that I tried to outline in the article. Of course, I don't want to jump too far ahead. We might have a chance to talk about future directions, but universities have responded with their own force and suppression of these efforts. They've demonized the students. They've used lawfare. They've used, the media. They've used the police as well in Canada, as they have in the U.S. York University in Toronto, in Alberta, University of Calgary, University of Alberta in Edmonton. They called in the police essentially immediately and forcefully removed the encampments. It's still an uphill battle, but there was the one victory that the University of Windsor students and faculty scored, and the university did adopt, strong BDS language. I say this all the time. I don't need an institution to say I follow specifically the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. I don't care if you state that as long as you do the actual work of cutting relations with the Israeli state and Israeli institutions. It doesn't matter what you frame it under. And I understand that's a bigger issue in the US, where some states you can't legally say that. And that's fine. You don't need to, as long as you cut ties with Israeli institutions and find the right language to do that. But yeah, the agreement has done that. Of course, it's facing much backlash. There's still a lot of pressure on it to take this agreement back. So it's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing story. But we should view it, Edward Said, I'll finish on this. Edward Said, many, many years ago, decades ago, said in an interview when asked about what his experience as an academic in New York was, and he said, well, it feels like I'm on a battlefield. And that's exactly where we're still at. Academia is a battlefield. It's a battlefield of narrative. and knowledge. And the good thing for our side is that we don't have to play around with all of that. We can just do an honest pursuit of knowledge, and that's it. That's all we have to do in order to put the Palestinian narrative forward. The other side has to conceal and lie and twist words around and play all kinds of rhetorical gymnastics to make their story narrative, somehow plausible. But that is the battlefield that we're on, and we have to continue to push and continue to insist on the honest pursuit of knowledge, sticking to truth and justice, because these are the only two weapons that we have.
Thank you, Muhannad. Lara, let's move on to you and to your essay. Well, your personal reflection, let's say. In your essay, you reflect on the genocide in Gaza as a descendant of Armenian genocide survivors yourself, and you raise powerful questions about the role of evidence in bringing about change. Specifically, you look at the idea that if only people knew, they would stop the violence. Can you describe your own experiences as a student, as an educator, and otherwise, and what they've revealed for you about this idea about evidence and knowledge in a time of genocide?
Yeah. So one of the things that I hope the JPS piece gets across is that while the idea that if only people knew the genocide would stop was, and I think, and is naive, making sure people still know matters, but for different reasons, right? And maybe idealistic is a better word than naive. So last century, as a student grappling with Armenian genocide histories, which is also part of my family history, I, initially believed that if more people knew that history, Turkish government denialism, which, is in many ways akin to Israeli government denials, also includes massive and well-funded PR campaigns in the US, as well as pressures in the academic realm. And in that case, those are PR campaigns and pressures to continue to deny history, right? So it's a refusal to acknowledge violence enacted in the past. Okay, I digressed a bit. So I thought at the time that people not knowing was the reason the Turkish state denial was so successful. And obviously, I was missing an awareness and analysis of structural power and of geopolitics that I later learned in grad school and beyond. And I also hadn't reached the point where I thought, like I do most days, now that human beings are, capable of unfathomable violence, and we need structures in the world to control that violence. And the ones we currently have that are supposed to do that are racist and corrupt. So at this point, I think it's beyond obvious that evidence and knowledge don't necessarily lead to outcomes like stopping genocide, but I still think they matter. And to return to Gaza and the ongoing Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, I think evidence, knowledge, and teaching about genocide is crucial for two other interrelated reasons. One reason is that the goal of genocide, including the genocide the Israeli state is currently perpetrating, is in the end absolute cultural and historical erasure. So every moment of witnessing and speaking and writing works against the erasure that is the ultimate goal of the Zionist project. And second, if we step outwards again and think about the violence of Zionist settler colonialism as a non-exceptional instance of the violence of colonialism and its aftermaths, we're then forced to think about the current genocide as not only Israeli state violence and US state violence, but the violence of a colonial global world system predicated on white supremacy and on the idea that certain nations and peoples are resources to be exploited and extracted, or barriers to resources to be eliminated by those in power. And this is some of what I think Muhannad was getting at as well. And one of the tactics of power within that system is to control the narrative, right? Which brings us full circle back to higher education and the higher education fight around Palestine speech here. I did a Palestine in Gaza 101 for the staff at a public official's office last year in California. And during the Q&A, there was one very, very visibly upset man who, when I called on him to ask his question, asked, with anger, why people cared now about Gaza when no one had cared when his people were being genocided in Rwanda. And I did not have a good answer for him. I said something, inadequate and vague about racism, and how, no one cares about Black on Black violence in Africa. And also that many people right now don't care about Gaza. And that was partly why I was doing this work and this talk at his office. But his voice has stayed with me. And his voice is part of why I keep coming back to this idea that living in a time of genocide is simultaneously unbearable and unthinkable. And of course has happened over and over again in the past. And during the Rwandan genocide, the United Nations, the United States government, the French government, they all knew what was happening. And for different reasons, didn't stop it. But my recollection is that Rwanda wasn't part of public discourse in the US to the degree that Gaza is today, right? And part of that is social media, and part of that is the directness of US involvement in Gaza. So the stakes are different here. But I think the two biggest differences are first, the extraordinary work that Palestinians in Gaza have been doing and continue to do, even in conditions of starvation at this point, to ensure that their narrative circulates. And second, the massive student-led anti-genocide movement that's grown over the past, nearly 2 years. And both of those absolutely have to do with making sure that people know. So while I've abandoned, obviously, the idealistic or naive notion that people knowing will automatically stop the violence, I think people knowing, or another way to put it is education, matters because it has the potential to lead to long-term structural change. I've seen students who learn about Palestine for the first time as undergrads go on to organize at a much larger scale, to work for organizations where they can actually play a role in shaping public discourse, to teach others, and that has to matter. And I think we're actually seeing the effects of that right today in the movement. Or as Shireen noted, the idea of this conversation, there wouldn't be that many of us in these academic positions. There weren't, several decades ago. So that has mattered. Another example, a group of us led a 10-year campaign at the American Anthropological Association to get the AAA to vote to adopt BDS, which it eventually did after 10 years. And, no matter what the utility of a random academic association doing so, it had a huge impact in terms of political education. So we can confidently say today that the majority of anthropologists have stood against this genocide and understand the problems of Israeli settler colonialism and apartheid. And that would not have been the case 15 or 20 years ago. And I think one reason that anthropology faculty, and we can say this about, American studies and ethnic studies faculty as well, have played key roles in Palestine solidarity and activism since then, is that years and years of political education that was being done within those disciplines. Okay, so one last thought. At the end of the JPS piece, I mentioned how John Berger calls on those of us witnessing violence to confront the systems of political unfreedom that stifle our capacity to stop that violence. And I think that's very clearly where we are. Right? It's systemic, and the purpose of making sure people know is to mobilize them to work towards that kind of systemic change. And of course, there are many people who know and don't care, or tune it out, or are blinded by their racism, or numbed by their material comforts. But many do care and are working towards change, and understand that it is the only ethical way to be in the world right now, is to be fighting against this genocide and speaking against this genocide. And that sounds very hopeful, but to be honest, now I'm going to go back to Shireen's spectrum of hope and despair. We can see the ways the movement here is growing and building really clearly. And we can see the changes in the realm of international political machinations. I think we're even seeing some changes in the realm of international law and law here in the US. We've clearly won the moral grounds fight, but we're also all waiting for that moment when this all actually adds up to stopping the genocide, right? And so I have to fall on the end side of hope that it will all connect. And until then, we just all keep speaking and teaching with Palestinians in Gaza in mind, in our speech, and as our model for doing so. I'll stop there.
Lara. I think it's a good segue to the question to Shireen, who reminds us in each of her editorials to remember Palestinians in Gaza and to learn from them. Shireen, your editorials have invited us to reflect first and foremost on the human stories behind the genocide, on the broader regional and global picture taking place, and on what we can learn from witnessing Palestinians and from Palestinian stories in Gaza. We've also been at the forefront of campaigns, including at the American Historical Association, as you described earlier, to bring about change from within academia. As an educator, a scholar, an activist, and as a Palestinian, can you tell us what these experiences have been like for you and what they've revealed for you about the state of education in this time of genocide?
Thank you, Nadim. Well, first, I want to thank the incredible editorial team at JPS, which is Nadim Bawalsa, Rasmi Abdelnabi, and Maria Khouri. And I think for the four of us, it's been a place of refuge, that we can produce knowledge on Palestine in these times of genocide. And I see some questions in the chat about, how can I get a fellowship at IPS? With that, I would say we are going to make a call very soon for internships with modest stipends, but that will be hopefully an opportunity for people to contribute and participate and learn. And folks are also asking, how can I download these articles? And I would just urge that people really try and subscribe to the Journal of Palestine Studies and you can get institutional access at your universities, but it's a small measure of support for what is now, this journal has been around since 1971. It is the leading flagship English language journal, and it is part on Palestinian studies. It's not I've had colleagues who say, oh, there's something so-called Palestinian studies, right? And this gets back to the infrastructures of denial that we talked about, right? What Muhannad was saying, ways agenda really relies on its denial. And I think collectively, I thought was really powerful what Lada said about every word that we write about Palestine. Palestinian voices in particular is really crucial, right? And I do often really make that urge to people because I think there is a way that Palestine has become an incredible magnet for many scholars and people to think with and think about. But I would remind you that Palestine is neither a laboratory nor a case study. Palestine is a place full of history, full of knowledge production, full of lessons for the rest of us. So, please, I think, doing that work is really crucial. In the editor's notes, I've thought a lot, I was co-editor with Rashid Khalidi of JPS, where I had the great honor of being mentored by him. And since January, I've kind of taken on the task of editing. And every 4 months, I try to do a roundup of, what's happening from the perspective of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, neither to heroize them nor to place them in a position of complete victimhood, but to really understand what does it mean? What does it mean to be a child, to parent, to age? What are the kinds of challenges that people face? How do they help us understand and think about Palestine differently? And I think I've tried in each of those editorials to do the kind of ethnographic archival work through the journals and testimonies that we have access to. And here I will lift up again the multiple testimonies that the Institute for Palestine Studies has featured from people in Gaza, both in Arabic and in translation. Many people have done this amazing work. So please, really, I think that's a major archival source for us to think with, and to reject this whole, a lot of people will say to us, oh, let's humanize the Palestinians. And I know I'm repeating myself, and everybody who's heard me speak has heard me say this. I reject that formation. No colonial force ever has the power to assign or take away our status as humans. It is precisely that attempt to exclude us from the category of the human that is a colonial logic. We reject that binary, and we try to work from the place of understanding life and the things that we are facing, the moment that we are in, from the perspective of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So I wanted to make a couple more points, but I think have I reached my limit? Okay, so I wanted to just, make a couple of points that I think speak more to, like, what does it mean to be in North America and Western Europe? Actually, scratch Western Europe. I just came away from a year in Germany, and it's a totally different context there. And I think those differences are important. First, I just want to again return to the question of the university and and the public university in particular, with all my love and respect to the people fighting the good fight in the private institutions. The broader right-wing consolidation that we're in relies on miseducation. It relies on making us stupid, right? So of course they're going to come after universities. It's as everybody has said, a project of instilling fear, and they're afraid of us and they're instilling in us fear. But it's also really reminds us that that kind of miseducation, we can't succumb to it. And I wanted to just quickly reflect on the ways that, in 3 points, of course, everybody knows about Project Esther. It made the New York Times, which I guess now means that it's mainstream, and it's important that we all read those details, because actually it's the plan that we are now experiencing. So the Project Esther as a kind of launching ground for the Trump administration. Also, another thing to think about is the way that just at the beginning of the Trump administration in January, some of the first executive orders that were put out by the Trump administration had to do with first the executive order, which stated that it's the policy of the United States to protect its citizens from non-citizens who espouse a hateful ideology, and a second executive order, which stated that it's the policy of the United States to combat anti-Semitism vigorously using all available and appropriate legal tools. And so from the very beginning of this Trump administration has been this focus on Palestine, on teaching Palestine, on educating about Palestine. And I think it's really important here to look at the ways that this, we've talked a bit about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. This has been highly documented and is now being documented and criticized by US-based and Europe-based Jewish scholars who say, we come from a spectrum of positions on Israel and what's happening in Gaza, and we reject the weaponization of anti-Semitism. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. The material gain of this genocide, right? And the way that our universities are complicit in that is another thing that we have to hold tightly to. Rebecca spoke about this. I would say that it's important for everybody to read Francesca Albanese's report that came out, in which she has really shown how the attempt to extinguish the very existence of the Palestinian people in Palestine has been of material benefit to so many. And this attempt to really create an architecture of subordination, as one scholar put it, is like Gaza and Palestine are really crucial to that. So I think those material gains are really important for us to think about and connect to our universities and the way that they have been willing to barter academic freedom. Right. And so one of the things that's been really, and I'll end with this, one of the things that has been really shocking to me. So all of us are in this kind of moment in which, I'll just speak for myself, where I'm constantly shocked, but not surprised. I'm always shocked, but I'm never surprised. But what's been interesting to me has been seeing how people facing this anticipatory obedience and this anti-democratic conduct of long-held associations, how shocking and surprising it is to them. Whereas for many of us, it's not shocking or surprising, right? And so I think this is the point that gets back to what Lara was saying about, all of these multiple struggles, right? Armenian, Black liberation, queer liberation, unions, labor organizing, working class, where everything has been revealed. We are in a moment where the masks are off. And as frightening and as, disgusting and shameful, the cowardice, the lows that some of these institutions and associations are willing to go to mask and hide the truth. It's also a moment of immense power for our future organizing, because all of the masks are now off.
Thank you, Shireen, for that very uplifting message. I want to, we still have some time. We have about 20 or so minutes. I'd like to ask a second set of questions to each of our speakers tonight. Rebecca, let's go back to you, and so curious, what has your experience been since the events of December 2024 that led to your designation as persona non grata? How do you envision your ongoing role as a scholar and educator at NYU from here on out?
Well, let me just emphasize that I have not been on campus since December 2024. I've been on leave. I've been in Hong Kong, where in fact I've learned a great deal about what the possibilities for solidarity are. Of course, Hong Kong went through its own repressive moments some years back and is still sort of metabolizing and normalizing that repression in the academic world. But I have three distinct things I want to say, most of which are not about my personal experience because I wasn't on campus. What I would say just generally is that I intend to continue my educational endeavors and the endeavors in concert with my comrades and the students to educate and to bring to visibility and to remain to keep in visibility what is ongoing in Israel and in Palestine and West Bank and Iran and all many other places. In terms of masks are off that Shireen was talking about, yes. I think that one of the and what Lara was talking about and what all of us are talking about, education matters in part because it politicizes. And I think what we have seen is, and this is what they're afraid of course, and this is why education is in their crosshairs, is what they have seen is that the more people know, the more political they get. And this is not to be starry-eyed about if only they knew. I agree that that is not the case. That people know, and as Zizek once said about ideology, they know and yet they do anyway, right? So it's not about like and yet concealment nevertheless is their strategy. And the more we reveal, the more we educate, the more we potentially politicize. And this was very clear from my studies as a China scholar. It's very clear that each of the rounds of politicization that have happened in China from 89 to 2014 in Hong Kong, 2019 in Hong Kong, all of them fail, and the Sunflower Movement 2014 in Taiwan, all of them failed. In other words, none of them achieved their goals. But what they did do was to politicize one generation after the next. Now, some turned away from that politicization, but others have metabolized that politicization and made it part of their everyday lives and part of their everyday practices. And I think that that's what we now, as educators in North America, have to continue to do fearlessly and boldly and in the face of what is going to be progressively more and more constraints on our ability to educate. And so that's one point I wanted to make. Another point I wanted to make, which I think is very, very important, is that while many of our organizations have been running a full scale away from the genocide, full scale away from solidarity with Palestine, one of our organizations has stepped up, and that's AAUP. The Association for American University Professors, under a very new leadership, under a very new mandate from its membership, has now really stepped up, is taking on the Trump administration and many other aspects of the repression in order to, and this is judicially, and we know that the judiciary now can be bought and sold, and so this is not a really secure way of securing our freedoms. But the AUP has been running institutes for recruitment, has been politicizing faculty, and while I am very, very aware of most of our faculty still sitting on the sidelines and not participating, nevertheless, the membership in AUP has been growing exponentially. As part of the AUP, the Day of Action that started 2 years ago as a minor sort of endeavor of many of us, and now last April became a real movement, has a Palestine caucus that is part of this AUP umbrella. But it's also different from AUP. It's called Coalition of Academics in Higher Education, or Coalition of Activists. I know, Kareem, you're here on the chat, so maybe you'll correct me on the actual name. But CAHE, CAHE, has a Palestine caucus that Kareem Matar from Colorado has been heading up. And it has really, really galvanized and organized a huge swath of Middle America, Coastal and Northern and Southern United States, and has really become a national resource. So much so that it was actually cited as in the Rubio versus AUP lawsuit as by the government as an exhibit for how freedom of speech has not been canceled, because look, they can do this and we don't intervene, which means that we are being surveilled. However, so the intervention is coming, I assume. Third point I wanted to make is very tangential on one level, but also very important to a Coalition for Action in Higher Education. Thank you, Karim. Yes, is just about China and Taiwan. China has often been cited as a pro-Palestinian partner, as a refuge for pro-Palestinian speech, and so on. That's a misnomer and is in fact untrue. They have been a Chinese government and state institutions have been feeding the surveillance technologies and have been pioneering Israeli surveillance technologies in the Uyghur regions and so on. And so, as many of us have talked about, these are all interconnected. The Palestine question, as it were, or the suppression of Palestinian speech, is connected to settler colonialisms, not only in the United States, but in China and elsewhere. Meanwhile, Taiwan just announced that it is funding a West Bank medical facility that is organized by Zionist Israelis, and it is and so Taiwan, which is implicated in all sorts of anti-China stuff, is also pro-Israeli. So the international solidarities around these issues is quite complex, and I would urge all of us to be very, very careful about how we position ourselves in our international solidarities, because these are not at all clear. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that word of caution. Muhannad, let's move on to you and speak about your experience and your deep involvement and knowledge of the BDS movement as well, and as a Palestinian yourself, nearly 2 years into the genocide. How do you assess the trajectory of student-led BDS campaigns, whether on Canadian campuses or more broadly, and what do you foresee for them?
Yeah, it's a big question. Let me try to address 2 points in relation to that. First is the trajectory of institutions themselves. For millennia, philosophers have asked the question of, how do institutions survive and so on. And really the key to that is legitimacy. An institution cannot survive without legitimacy. Now, there are multiple ways in which institutions gain their legitimacy. I'm going to highlight two. One is through norms and values and the idea that they stand for greater ideals and greater goals for the betterment of humanity and higher ideals we all strive to be aligned with, the forces of the good, quote unquote. And in the age of colonial racial capitalism, instrumental gains and profits and advantages and so on that they can proffer to individuals for being a part of them. In both of those ways, they establish their legitimacy. I think what we're seeing right now is a complete erosion of the first kind of legitimacy. Institutions are no longer convincing younger generations that they stand for anything other than profit making. Their only source of legitimacy that they have left, well, I shouldn't be so final in that judgment, but we're heading towards that path. We're heading towards the path where their only source of legitimacy will be what they can instrumentally offer you to gain your allegiance to them. They can help you make a living, and so on and so forth. I think if you're starting to look at it critically, you'll see that actually both legs of legitimacy are being eroded slowly. The first one is today institutions, the master office, Shireen has said, it's clear. Some of the 35 and older are still hanging on to some notion of like, no, we can still save the liberal order, blah, 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 blah. But the younger generation is just like, F all of this. This is all BS. It was always a lie. And they're right. By the way, I'm not one of those academics that tells you this side says this. No, I do value judgments. The younger generation is right. These institutions never did stand up for those ideals that they proclaim to stand for. Now, the other way in which institutions pull you in is to go, well, you might not like us, but this is how you make a living. Look at this nice house and nice car and good food, all of that you can get through us. Well, guess what? Most of these students today are looking at their future and going, I'm looking at best precarious employment. Buy a house, what a joke. I'm never going to get there. Buy a car, no, the insurance is too high, etc., etc. They're not looking at these institutions as something that can offer them lifelong support, economic support. So you have kind of a twin emergency situation coming for these institutions where this younger generation feels no connection to them. And they view them as really their enemies. Now, I think the younger generation is right to think both of those things. They could go in different directions, by the way. They can go a fascist route. They can go a progressive route. But some of the fascist route that we're seeing in some of those younger generations who voted in large numbers for Trump and, follow some of these far right ideas and all of that also has its basis in a distrust of these institutions, mainstream media, universities, governments, and so on. This is going to have very serious consequences for all of these institutions and these states moving forward. How it's going to play out, I don't know. I'm not going to try to predict the future. I think that's a very risky business for us to try to do that. But that a reckoning is coming. It's already happening, but an even more serious reckoning, I think, is on its way. I think mainstream media will be the first to feel it. I ask my students, I encourage everyone to do the same. How many of you watch mainstream media in Canada? Who watches the CBC and reads the Toronto Star? Nobody raises their hand. And teaching sociology students, they are actively engaged in news and news consumption, but they're not going to those spaces and they don't trust them. So there's no they feel no connection to them. People within those working within those institutions are looking at their career and going, I have precarious employment here. Why do I care about these institutions? Why don't I blow the whistle? Maybe heck, I can even make more money if I blow the whistle than I do staying in them. I can create my own brand, et cetera, et cetera. These things are happening right now. And they're going to accelerate, in my view, because I don't see those institutions acting in ways that is going to change the trend of that. And universities are no different. Many students are looking at universities with very critical eyes towards their disciplines. Many of my students, for example, tell me, I want more of what you're saying, not the other stuff I'm getting in my more conventional parts of my education. They have no faith that they're going to get a job from a degree that's going to, allow them to live a basic life, a decent life. So these, and I don't know how the university is going to be transformed in relation to that and what it's going to look like, but that a transformation is on its way, and that is not to mention AI and all of these things that are coming into the picture and radically transforming education. But there are some big things happening, and my sense today, as frustrated as we are that nothing is happening, and we should be frustrated, and we should always have that sober assessment in front of us. I believe when big changes come down the line, it could even be 50 years from now. I think the genocide in Gaza will be on the forefront, would be part of the rallying cry for radical transformations for years and years and years to come. Again, how that comes about, what it looks like, I don't know. There's a few other points that I kind of wanted to mention, but I'm running out of time. But very, very quickly, one of the things, just to kind of bring it back to a very more specific level here, one of the things that is happening within the student activism is something that is not new. It happens across all solidarity activism, all across different decades, is that there are frictions between different factions. The big one that I outlined a little bit in my article is the reformists versus the radical sides. There's interpersonal frictions that happen within movements that last this long. These things do concern me, that people become more concerned about those questions and less concerned about their role in the battlefield to fight against the genocide. It is something to keep an eye out on. People are experiencing fatigue, trauma, mental health issues as a result of the violence they're consuming on their TV screens that they're seeing every day, and the violence that they experience, trying to scream and get it to all stop. So these are things that I think we should be paying attention to, and trying our best to keep our focus on Gaza, and what we need to do here to help Palestinians in Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhannad, for that very important reminder. I'd like to give both Lara and Shireen a chance to also speak, share some final thoughts, and I hope that our audience can bear with us for just a few more minutes. Lara, let's go back to you. In your essay, you described the importance of archives, both through your ancestors' family stories surviving genocide in Armenia, through Nakba narratives, and today through the live-streamed genocide in Gaza. Can you tell us more about this idea of archiving and why you see it as so critical in this time?
Yeah, thank you. I'll say a bit with the caveat that I'm not a historian and would love to hear from them someday on this question. So earlier I said one reason education remains important is that the goal of genocide is absolute cultural and historical erasure, and that perpetrators of genocide exert their power to control the narrative, which generally means denial. And that's why the Turkish state example is so important, because it shows the persistence of denial and erasure for a century after the overt killing and murder, right? After the attempt to physically erase a people. And without the archives that exist and that have been created around the Armenian genocide, we would have no tools with which to fight that denial, right? And this is an archive that's been created. So yes, there were newspaper reports and photographs, and those have been gathered. And there are the journals and accounts of missionaries in the area and relief workers. But much of this is oral history. So there are numerous oral history projects, often initially prompted as those who had survived the genocide and could share firsthand experiences were aging. And we have exactly that has happened with the Nakba as well, numerous oral history projects gathering elders' firsthand experiences. And my point here is that archives didn't just emerge out of journalism and state documents, but they were painstakingly built by scholars and activists and people gathering their family histories. And those archives are the best and really only bulwark against state denial of genocide, which of course carries massive political and financial power behind it. So this is another reason archives matter. And this is why the extraordinary records we have of every moment of this horrifically violent Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, this is a body of evidence that so many Palestinian journalists have died to obtain. And this is why the knowledge production that the Journal and Institute of Palestine Studies has done and continues to do is so important. Another way to think about it is if evidence and archives didn't matter, the Zionist state wouldn't be systematically killing journalists. And I worry, now I'm going to sound like an old person for a moment. I worry about how much of this is digital because the digital infrastructure seems so fragile to me, not in the same ways that physical archives are fragile, but because those of us creating the archives are generally not in control of the servers and technologies on which they rely. So I think we need to be thinking about protecting evidence and archives for the future narrative, as well as for shaping the narrative of the moment and thinking about preserving this massive body of knowledge that's being produced. And again, this is why the institutions that are doing this work, the Institute for Palestine Studies, now the AAUP and CAHE, and I'm going to add MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, into this list. This is why these institutions are so critical as well. Because again, we're archiving as evidence to stop the violence now, we're archiving against cultural erasure, and we're archiving against the erasure of history. And again, following the model of Palestinians in Gaza as we do so. And that's where I will stop. And I really want to hear from Shireen. So.
Thank you, Lara. Shireen, let's end with you. In your latest editorial, in the latest issue of JPS, you ask us to think about how Palestine is both shrinking and how it is also everywhere. Can you tell us what you mean by this?
Sure. So in an obvious sense about Palestine shrinking, we've witnessed the land shrinking. We've witnessed the multiple ways that that deprivation has become a technology of mass murder. We've also witnessed the ways that the Israeli assault exceeds the Gaza Strip. We've witnessed the settler rampage in the West Bank, the full annexation of the West Bank. We've witnessed Israeli assaults on Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iran. Right now, Israel occupies more land in the Eastern Mediterranean than it has ever occupied before historically. We've witnessed the way that academic freedom and free speech and the attacks on them will not remain confined to a faraway place of so-called conflict. And we know that liberal democracy and its international institutions were founded on the denial of many people as fully human rights-bearing subjects, and Palestinians have been among them. And I think the demise of these institutions that we are witnessing today, from the United Nations to all of the assumptions that we have made about liberal democracies to the institutions in which we teach themselves, are really cementing that exclusion, as Rebecca put it so powerfully. I think it's important to remember the way that the governments of the United States and Israel pathologize empathy, and how the criminalization of protest speech and words like ethnic cleansing, even photographs of Palestinian children, are really part of that pathology. And I think what Muhannad said about the way forward, is a really crucial reminder. And I take heart always from the story of someone named Uday Elzaga, who on Monday, March 17th, at 2 a.m. in the morning, was subjected to shelling, Israeli shelling, and it was March 18th, and he, gathered his family and went downstairs and basically rushed to find everybody. And by the time that they made it downstairs to the building, body parts and burned flesh was everywhere. Something that is, if you're reading closely these testimonies, it's something that happens 4 or 5 times daily. And they do this thing where Ardei and his neighbors basically gather the remains of their neighbors and their friends and their families, and they put them in plastic bags, and then they hold vigil over them, uh, um, over these dismembered people, and they hold vigil protecting them from the dogs who are throwing stones at the dogs who are attempting to surround these body parts. And the ambulance wouldn't arrive till 2 hours later. As we know, Palestinians in Gaza don't have access to shrouds, they don't have access to burial space, all of these things. And it struck me that, if we look at this family and we look at Ardei in particular, the lesson that we learn is to guard one another even when we are in fragments. So even when you feel that everything is being torn up, remember Ardei and his family and the way that they guarded one another even when they were there, all of their neighbors and friends and family were dismembered.
Thank you, Shireen, for these powerful final words. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd like to thank each of our speakers for their critical interventions and insights to this discussion on education in a time of genocide. And thank you, our audience, for tuning in and for your engagement throughout. Please remember to check out our latest issue of the Journal of Palestine Studies. And please do support the Institute for Palestine Studies, without which JPS does not exist and without which critical events like these would not be possible. At a time where knowledge production around Palestine is being criminalized and violently suppressed, IPS is in urgent need of your help. Please do support us if you can. The link to do so is in the chat box. I wish you all continued strength and perseverance, and desperately hope that we soon see an end to the injustices committed against faculty and students of conscience speaking out against genocide, and to the unfathomable suffering of our people in Gaza and across colonized Palestine. Thank you all, and good night.